What's going on, everyone? So in this video lecture, I'm going to cover the entirety of chapter 23, which is covering the digestive system. Some of this information has been covered in previous videos that I posted in the module, but here's my version of it. And so what I would do is I always suggest taking notes on this stuff and follow along with me in the chapter if you want. So Um, the digestive system is responsible for the processing and the uptake of nutrients that you're taking into your body through the things that you eat and that you drink. There's three basic processes, or four basic processes, I should say: motility, secretion, digestion, both mechanical and chemical, and absorption. So what we're going to do is walk through the various parts of the digestive system, and I'll list out how each of these parts work in the motility area, secretion, digestion, and absorption areas. All right, so let's get into it. Motility is how the substances are going to be moving through that particular area of the digestive system. All of this movement is going to be due to, for the most part, smooth muscle contractions. Now, if you remember, smooth muscle is obviously involuntary. We're not thinking about doing these things. You can't control it. And the reason that they are able to work, these smooth muscle contractions are able to work in unison, is because they have these gap junctions, which, remember, cardiac muscle has as well, that allow signals to sort of spread across the entire muscle, and so that they can all contract at the same time. And they also have their own set of pacemaker cells, the interstitial cells of Cajal. And they're just the pacemaker cells of the smooth muscle contraction in the digestive system. So there's two types of movement. There's propulsive movement, which is just when you're pushing contents forward throughout this tube, which is your digestive system, basically. And then there's mixing movement, which promotes food breakdown and facilitates absorption. So then we have secretion, and secretion, as we know already by talking about our endocrine system and a little bit about exocrine, is just when you release chemicals into something, and for this we're talking about into the digestive system, particularly into the lumen or the opening of the digestive system. We're going to talk about exocrine secretion. Remember, exocrine secretion is through glands. That will be like fluid, electrolytes, enzymes, the mucus, and bile. And then endocrine secretion, where it just releases straight into the bloodstream. And remember, we talked about endocrine system. That's the release of hormones that are going to help control these digestive processes. And then we have digestion, where we have mechanical digestion, which is mechanical like it sounds. It's a physical thing of mixing, churning, chewing, breaking down large masses of food into smaller masses of food. And then we have chemical digestion, which is the use of enzymes to break down chemical bonds of large, what we call polymers, into smaller monomers. So just a little refresher, if you have proteins, those are the polymers, you break those down into the amino acid monomers. If you have polysaccharides, those long chains of sugars, you can break them down into monosaccharides. If you have lipids or fats, you break them down into glycerides and fatty acids. So there's always a glyceride and 3 fatty acids in a lipid, so you break them down into their subunits. Those are hydrolysis reactions, or taking water and breaking or lysing a chemical bond. We're not going to be talking about this, but just to remind you that if you're doing a building reaction, those are the dehydration synthesis reactions, where you take a water molecule out and join 2 monomers together to make a polymer. So we talked about all that in previous lectures, just to kind of remind you of some terminology. Absorption is the final process, and probably the most important, definitely the most important. If you're not absorbing any of your nutrients, you're not going to be living very long. It's the movement of substances from the lumen, or which I call the opening of the digestive tract, into the cells of the digestive tract, and then eventually into your blood or your lymph to the rest of the cells of your body. These are things like very tiny microscopic molecules, water, vitamins, minerals, electrolytes, all the things that you know that you need for your body and your cells to be healthy. Like we can talk about digestive processes by their location, and that's what we're going to do next. Digestion begins in the mouth. That's where we're going to begin. And it continues through the digestive tract. Right here you can see in the mouth, down the esophagus, into the duodenum. Into your stomach, down, mixes in your stomach into the duodenum, which is the beginning of your small intestine, through the small intestine, into the large intestine, out the anus. The digestive organs are continuous along that tract, but they are separated by various sphincters, and those sphincters allows them to be separated into specialized functional regions where different functions happen in different areas. So let's start in the mouth. In the mouth, you put a bite of food into your mouth and you start to chew it. That's also called mastication. What does your mouth secrete? Well, there's saliva, which is produced by salivary glands, and saliva is 99.5% water. It's mostly water, but there are a few enzymes in them. Amylase is an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. There's obviously mucus going on in your mouth, and there's also lysozyme, which is another enzyme, but it's actually not for digestion of food. It's an antibacterial enzyme that protects you from getting sick if there's any bacteria in your mouth. Here's a cool little thing you can do, a little trick, a little lab, I guess. Go into your pantry, if you have it, and take a piece of white bread and try to get one that's like the really crappy version, like Wonder Bread. Put it in your mouth, and you can probably do this with like saltines as well. Put it in your mouth, chew it up, and don't swallow it. Just hold it in your mouth for a few minutes, 15 minutes if you like, as long as you can go. What you're going to start to taste is a sweetness, and that is that starch being broken down into its monosaccharides, which is basically just sugar. So you'll taste this big polysaccharide starch being broken down because of the amylase. So I suggest trying it if you haven't. So basically that's the only thing we can digest in our mouth are the carbohydrates into their monosaccharides, nothing else, and we don't absorb anything in the mouth at all. So it's basically the mouth is to use your teeth to break down this material into a mush that we can now bring into the rest of the digestive system. Then we bring it back to the throat or the pharynx, and the pharynx is your throat, and then down into your esophagus, which is the tube that leads down to your stomach. So you obviously have to swallow, which means pushing with your tongue the ball of food, which we call a bolus, into your throat and down the esophagus. Now, if you've ever choked on something, I hope not, but that would be your food going down into your airway or your trachea, and that would be because your epiglottis, unfortunately, didn't close off that airway. But if everything goes according to plan, when you swallow, your epiglottis should close off your airway. The bolus then moves down the esophagus, right here, down the esophagus to the stomach through what is called peristalsis, or basically these rhythmic-like contractions of the smooth muscle that pushes the ball of food, or the bolus, down. Does the pharynx and esophagus secrete anything? Not much, but just mucus to make sure everything's getting coated and sliding along correctly. No digestion is happening here, and no absorption is happening here. We do have two esophageal sphincters that I'd like you to know. The first is the pharyngoesophageal sphincter, which is between your pharynx, the throat, and the esophagus, and that prevents air from entering the esophagus when you're not swallowing food. Basically just so you don't dry out your esophagus too much. And the gastroesophageal, or sometimes called cardiac sphincter, that's between your esophagus and the stomach, and it controls entry of food into the stomach and stops stomach acid from backflowing into your esophagus. If you, like me, sometimes, unfortunately, get a little bit of heartburn, that's what happens, that feeling. They call it heartburn because it's right in the middle of your chest and it's sort of by your heart, but it's actually your stomach acid going back up into your esophagus, and you get that burning sensation because of the acidity. And so that's what that is. So now we move down into the stomach. So you can see we've pushed this bolus through peristalsis down the esophagus and through this esophageal sphincter down into the stomach. What does the stomach do? So there is motility here, where smooth muscle can push in all directions on the stomach, and you break down the food even more into the stomach. It can also be inhibited. So if you are full, if there's if it's either if it's liquid, then it'll do it more. If it's solid in your stomach, it needs to it needs to do it less. If you're stressed, you'll break down your food less. It'll stop digestion. We've learned about that in the endocrine system. And then we have things like enterogastrones from the small intestine that will tell the stomach, hey, I need to continue doing a lot of work. Please stop doing your thing until I can do my thing. What kind of secretions do we get here? We get gastric juices up to 2 liters a day. HCl, which is your stomach acid, or hydrochloric acid, which is extremely acidic, like a 1 on the pH scale. That is secreted from cells called parietal cells. And then we have pepsin, which is secreted as pepsinogen, or basically the inactive version. Anytime you see ogen, that's just an inactive version of an enzyme. Pepsin is an enzyme that digests proteins. We obviously secrete a lot of mucus here so that our stomach acid doesn't burn the walls of our stomach. And then something called intrinsic factor, which is something that helps us absorb vitamin B12. It's a very important vitamin. And interestingly enough, if you have gastric bypass, which is actually cutting out a lot of your stomach, you have to take a supplement of intrinsic factor. I just think that's important to know. Not important to know, but interesting to know about absorbing vitamin B12. What happens in digestion here? So contrary to popular belief, not a lot of digestion happens within your stomach. And that's kind of crazy because we all say, oh, I'm digesting. My stomach is so full. Yes, you are digesting, but you're not in your stomach as much as you might think. The major function of your stomach is to store the food and obviously break it down. But not much digestion here. Absorption also not as much as you would think. What can get absorbed here is alcohol, and it's one of the reasons why you might throw up, because it can only take so much alcohol, so if you drink too much, it's going to tell you, we're going out the other way, buddy. And aspirin actually gets absorbed in the stomach. The pyloric sphincter, right here, this is the ability for the stomach to close off, and it allows the stomach to slowly release what has now been turned into chyme. So the food is a bolus, then gets broken down even more here through physical motility, and it becomes this paste, basically, and we call it chyme. And the pyloric sphincter allows for a slow release of this chyme into the duodenum or duodenum, whatever you want to call it, basically the beginning of your small intestine. Okay, then we could talk about 2 accessory organs to the small intestine before we talk about the small intestine themselves. So they are called accessory organs to the small intestine and to the digestive system because the pancreas and the liver certainly have other jobs to do than just aid in digestion, but when they are doing their digestive functions, they are called accessory organs. They secrete stuff via ducts into the duodenum. That means they are exocrine, secreting via ducts. What does the pancreas do? It secretes trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. In their inactive forms, these are enzymes that break down proteins. Now, I say that they're in their inactive form. What's the reason for that? The reason for that is, well, your pancreas is made up of protein. So if you've got an enzyme that's not where it's supposed to be, that breaks down protein, you're going to start digesting yourself. Therefore, it needs to be created in its inactive form, secreted somewhere that won't get harmed by it, and turned into its active form. But it also secretes amylase, which breaks down, like you said, carbohydrates, and lipase, which breaks down your lipids or your fats, in its active form because it's not going to do any damage. And then the important one here is the pancreas releases sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is an alkaline mixture, basically basic, and it can neutralize stomach acid because as soon as that stomach acid leaves the well-protected stomach, it can start burning other areas of your digestive system, and we don't want that. So the sodium bicarbonate mixes with the chyme in order to neutralize it. And then the liver, of course, secretes bile, which when is not being secreted gets stored in your gallbladder. Bile breaks down fats, and the bile salts, which is part of the bile, emulsifies fat. So basically it just goes around lipids. So if you've ever put fat in water, you'll see that it clumps up together and sort of sits on the surface. If we didn't have something to emulsify it, that could clog up our systems pretty badly. But luckily we have bile that can emulsify it, and basically what that means is allow it to be pushed through water and doesn't clump up. And so that's really important for these lipids. It holds it like this, then you get enzymes that can come into it and break it down into its triglycerides and its fatty acids that we're going to use for other things. So that's the pancreas and the liver. Let's get into the rest of the small intestine. What kind of motility happens here? It's called segmentation, where you get these ring-like contractions of the circular muscle, again, smooth muscle, that you get 9 to 12 cycles a minute, and it takes 3 to 5 hours to pass through the entirety of the small intestine. You get secretions of mucus and salt, but that's it, okay? So mucus, salt, and then what other things are secreted are mostly what things coming from the pancreas and the liver, the bile, and all of those other enzymes that help in digestion. What happens here is most of your digestion, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids, are all getting mostly digested here because we haven't digested much of anything yet, including being in the stomach. And then, of course, absorption. This is the main spot for it, where most of the absorption happens. All of your nutrients, all the electrolytes, and most of the water is getting absorbed in your small intestine. Notice that the small intestine is only called the small intestine because of its width, not for its length. This is the large intestine. It's much shorter, but it's just wider. So it's called the large intestine. We've got 3 regions here, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So that is your small intestine, and let's move on. This is just a look at how we increase surface area within our body to aid in absorption of materials. And so this is the microvilli, which is sometimes called the brush surface because, well, doesn't that kind of look like the end of a toothbrush? And basically this just increases surface area so that you get more area to do more absorption, and things can process quicker. You can get more material out of the food that you're intaking. One way that I could show you in your life how increasing surface area works, as I always tell students to do this. Go to your counter and pour a little bit of water and let it sit there. And just let it sit there and sit there and sit there. And you're going to see that it takes a pretty long time for it to evaporate. Now, take that same amount of water, pour it out, and spread it. Don't wipe it up, but spread it over the table, including, so it increases the surface area. And what you'll see is that without you wiping up too much of it, it evaporates much quicker because the surface area is increasing. So reactions like that will increase in their speed when you increase surface area. And that's the whole reason for villi and their tips called microvilli. Okay, what else? We're getting to the large intestine, which is sometimes called the colon. By the way, when I was a child, my friend wrote on his, this is going to probably make me sound old, on his MySpace, that what did he smell like? He smelled like his cologne, but he spelled it like this, colon. And you probably don't want to smell like your colon, but that's unfortunate for him. And I always remember it. So they say nobody else remembers your dumb mistakes. Well, I guess I do. I'm sure someone remembers mine. Motility, there are things called mass movements and haustral contractions. Haustral contractions are these ring-like contractions. They're very slow. You get one every 30 minutes or so. And then you get mass movements, which are contractions of large segments of the colon. And that basically drives waste forward and eventually so that you get defecation. You get 3 to 4 of these mass movements a day. And this is all happening very slowly. And that's actually a good thing because slow motility allows for colonies of good beneficial bacteria to grow. There's 500 to 1,000 different species of bacteria living in your gut that all play a large role in your overall health. And by the way, doctors and scientists are still thinking there's more and more information about how a healthy colon really impacts your overall health. In fact, people who are extremely sick have gotten fecal transplants, basically poop pills, freeze-dried poop pills, not exactly, but kind of, to replenish the colon's good bacteria. So look into that if you're interested. What gets secreted here? Not much other than mucus, just to keep everything coated in a nice mucus layer so that everything's sliding along right. Then, of course, we have digestion that should be finished by now, so no digestion is happening here. What's left is the indigestible waste, unabsorbed bile, fluid. I didn't write it here, but also the breakdown of red blood cells, that's bilirubin, is coming here. That's so red blood cells that are getting destroyed, you also excrete that in your feces. What's getting absorbed is almost all of the water left. If you have a nice and healthy bowel movement, it shouldn't be watery, right? It shouldn't be diarrhea. And also some salt from bile. And then, of course, it all ends in defecation when you get down to the tail end, basically, where you have the end of your colon, which is the rectum. The wall gets stretched, and that sends signals to open up this internal anal sphincter. And then, of course, when it's time to go to the restroom, you have voluntary control of the external anal sphincter. Okay, a few more slides here and we're all done. There are 3 phases that control digestive secretions. The first is the cephalic phase, and if you remember the word cephalic, you would think brain. And that's when you're basically, this all starts working the second that your brain starts to expect food. You might smell it, I can smell that pizza in the oven. You could see it. You might even see a McDonald's sign if you like McDonald's, and even that will get your stomach rumbling, right? Even just thinking about, oh man, my mom's chili, it's so good. Things like that. That actually can increase HCl, or stomach acid, pepsinogen, gastrin, the pancreatic juices, and secretion of bile. So really, you ever hear the term, my eyes were bigger than my stomach? Well, your brain, all of these brain signals can really, really impact your digestive secretions. The next is the gastric phase, and it's when your food first enters the stomach from your esophagus and starts to stretch the walls of the stomach. And that releases a lot more signals that tells your stomach to release more gastrin, more juices. It stimulates these large intestine movements. So basically it says we need to make space, so the large intestine, you need to move along. And then the intestinal phase is when food enters your small intestine. You have those enterogastrones, which will tell your stomach, hey, slow down, I got to start doing my work. And then the somatostatin, that further inhibits stomach secretions as well. So with that, we've covered basically all I would like to get into with the digestive system. Check back and see if I post any more videos on this, but if not, I'll see you in the next chapter.